My name is Stephan Shu tze. I have been in the game industry for over 15 years now. What I do, that's a hard question. Again, because of the situation and the history in the game industry, I always needed to do a bit of everything. So I started as a musician and a composer. So I've written music for fully orchestral scores. These days, I suspect my time is probably divided between being a composer and sound designer, but also a location recording because my company Sound Librarian, we create commercial sound effects libraries. But then we also create education and training material. So it's one of those things where it's quite difficult to do the elevator pitch in one sentence of what you do. So I guess that covers most of it. So this started, and I'm not sure where the motivation came from, but right from the very first project that I worked on, I wanted to collect my own material. And I think it was because I was provided with a small number of sound effects for this first project. And I listened to them, and there's this mechanical door that's been used in every science fiction film and every game for the last 100 years. And I think that one straight away went, hang on, I know this sound, and I've heard this sound so many times. And so I thought, well, all right, I need to get some fresh material, because in some ways it was also a fact that I couldn't afford to buy a lot of the sound effects libraries. So right from the word go, I started recording my own material, and I found very, very quickly that I really thoroughly enjoyed it. So there's a couple of aspects about it. There's one, it really gives you more control over the craft. It means that the sound design that you're doing for a project is really more bespoke. Because right from the raw material, you're getting sounds that won't be in any other project. And it doesn't matter even if you've got the same materials. If you found me the exact same materials that have been used in a very famous computer game and you gave them to me, the act of me recording them means they're going to be unique. So right from the word go, the raw materials you're working with, the palette that you've started with is going to be very, very fresh and different. So that was, I guess, the initial motivation, and then over the years I found that I enjoyed doing this. And I'd also had many friends and colleagues say, well, you've collected a lot. Why don't you just keep doing this and actually start building up your own collection? And so it came from collecting sounds, raw sound material for myself for projects I was working on, to expanding into creating sound libraries. So from the point of view of actually how you would approach it, it comes down to the same sort of inspiration that a composer might have for choosing instruments. So while you might get a composer who listens to some music and listens to maybe some Middle Eastern music and chooses some of the wind instruments from that, and then goes across to sort of, Far Eastern culture and decides to use some of the percussion instruments from that, I would look at what it is that I need for a particular sound, and then look at what particular elements, obviously things that are within my area, or that are within an area that I can, conveniently travel to, and then how I want to interact with those things. And very quickly, one of the best examples, I spent 3 years living in Japan, and a lot of that was living in a small country town up in northern Japan. And there was just down the road from where we were, there was I guess it was a council depot. And there was it was basically open, and there was piles of steel and piles of rock and piles of all sorts of things. And I was just like, this is free reign. This is literally toy shop sort of material, child in a toy shop. And so I over months, I would go up there and I'd spend an entire day just banging and crashing on giant steel girders. And then I would go back and play with the stones, and I'd go back, and then I'd come back to the steel girders months later and try something different. I'd get like a big rubber mallet and bash all of them with a rubber mallet, and some of those started to sound like a giant marimba. And so it was in itself a really beautiful experience, because I'm creating, I'm discovering textures and sounds and things that in a lot of cases I didn't even have a reason to use then. They were things that later on might be useful, but in some ways it became a little bit like Pokemon. I was just collecting these. I got to the point where I was collecting these for the sake of collecting them, and that was before I decided to start making commercial sound effects libraries. There's a few. Firearms is very difficult in Australia because we have very, very strict regulations. And also they're difficult because they have a massive dynamic range. While it's all very good going, well, this gun's going to go bang very, very loudly, therefore you need to have a microphone that's capable of dealing with a loud sound, and you've got to turn your input levels down. That's oversimplifying it, because at the same time, the actual mechanical action of the gun is occurring, and that's something that also needs to be captured, and that's something that's fairly quiet. So you will need to have, I mean, the optimum way of doing that is having many microphones all the way around, some very, very close, some very far away. And so the one that's close might be turned up very loud. And so when the explosion of the bullet goes off, that will probably peak out, but you will get an initial bit that might be the mechanical click and a tail afterwards that might be the bit you need. And so there's a complexity in that. I would say more difficult though is vehicles. I spent 2 years collecting a lot of sounds for aircraft, and there's so many challenges there. One of the main ones actually was getting the permission to get access to them. Aircraft by their very nature are very, very dangerous, and I needed to be well aware that, you know, if it's a propeller plane, there is a giant blade that I've got to be very aware of at all times. Or there's a jet engine that I've got to be aware of at all times. And that can be difficult, because when you've got your headphones on and you're listening through the microphone, you're concentrating on getting the best sound. And so I instructed the tarmac crew to say, look, at any point in time, if I look like I'm going anywhere I shouldn't be going, just scream at me. And that's for my benefit as well as everybody else's. But then there's the obvious ones of, well, sure, I can stand in front of a jet fighter and I can record it while it's there, but it's not like I can stick a microphone to it on the outside of it while it's flying. So there become those sorts of just the reality challenges of, well, how does a microphone capture an aeroplane when it's flying? And so there were various different challenges that you overcome there. But yeah, vehicles are really a big challenge a lot of the time. That, I think, depends a lot on the skill and the creativity of the sound designer. I can recognize a lot of my sounds, and the less they manipulate them, the more recognizable they are. But one of the other things that I do is that I really love working with sounds. I think that a good analogy would be, you know, a child in kindergarten doing finger painting. They get to get their hands into the paint and make a mess and everywhere, and then they can play around, and then they can get different colors and mix them all together. So one of the first things I do with any sound, if I get a raw sound, and it doesn't matter what it is, I'll put it into an editor, and I will usually pitch shift it up 2, 3, 4 octaves and have a listen to it, and then I'll pitch shift it down 2, 3, 4 octaves, because what that gives to me is, this is the scope of what that sound can be. And it teaches me things as well, because any sound being a raw tool, it's like getting a piece of wood. You and I will look at a piece of wood and think, well, okay, it's a square block and we can do something with it. A real craftsman with wood will look at that and go, where does the grain go? What is the shape? What is the dimensions of this? How can I shape this? What can I do with it? And by listening to a sound across its full range, there are so many things that are incredible. A lot of people don't realize that if you get the sounds of an average bird, just an average small bird, and pitch shift them down an octave, they will quite often sound like a much larger bird that you might see in the Amazon. But if you pitch shift them down a couple more octaves, they actually start to sound like various different species of monkeys. So what we've got is, we've got creatures on this planet that actually sound a lot like each other. They're obviously producing very similar tonal material, and when you pitch shift it, all of a sudden you're simulating other sounds. And so sound design obviously involves potentially pitch shifting sounds, but also blending them with other sounds and combining them. So the more you deform a sound, the more you combine it with other things, the less recognizable it will be from its original source. But I really think that understanding the full potential of what a single sound can do means that whole craft of sound design is something that you get so much more potential out of. First, I want to say that I actually think a lot of people really miss some opportunities with creatures. I think we simplify our creatures too much to be just simply, grr, I'm a threat, and blah, I'm dead. And I think I've always tried to make the creatures have so much more personality because, I mean, especially we've got artists producing beautiful models that quite often have really amazing animations and have real personality. And I think if we from a sound point of view, we can give them even more personality. So what I would try to do is I try to look at a creature and not look at it and go, oh, it looks like a bear, therefore I should use a bear sound. I try to look at it and think, what does that represent to me? Is it something that is a threat? Is it something that's a threat because it's a carnivore? Or is it something that's a threat in the way an elephant is, just simply because it's so big and it's potentially unpredictable? An elephant's not going to run me down to eat me, but it might run me down to protect its own herd or to protect itself. But those are going to be very, very different sounds. I think a creature that is basically predatorial is going to have a sound that it's going to emanate that is while it's hunting you. You are its prey, and there's going to be some sort of sound that's going to come out that I think is going to have that sort of motivation to it. Whereas a large herbivore is probably more than likely going to have some sort of thing that's a warning. It's going to say, don't come here because I'm going to have to run. You're going to force me to run you down. So I think what you're trying to get there, first of all, is you're trying to get what is the emotional impact you want that creature to have, and what is its behavior like? How is it going to behave? Then you can start to think, all right, is it a big creature or a small creature? Now, by and large, sound just works based on physics. A mouse is generally going to create a high-pitched and probably fairly quiet sound because it's got small vocal cords. It's like a very short violin string. Whereas an elephant, it has larger vocal cords, it has a larger set of lungs behind it, has more bulk, so it's likely to be a bigger sound. That's not always going to be the case, but it is something that as humans, emotionally we respond to. So if I build something that's supposed to be some giant titan and it squeaks at you, unless I'm trying to purposely have some sort of comedic value to this thing, it's likely to go against what people are used to. So you need to sort of at least keep that in mind. So again, I've come to the creatures and I've decided, all right, what sort of emotional impact do I want to have? Then it comes down to what sort of textural behavior do I want to have? And I'll use the example of the dinosaurs. When I worked on a Jurassic Park game many years ago, I had to create the sounds for the dinosaurs. Now, the obvious ones like the T-Rex and the Raptor, which you know from the movie, well, they were pretty much, we just used those sounds. But we had quite a large range of big herbivores. Now, the thing about herbivores, they're herd animals. So I had to work out their type of behavior. Now, herd animals generally, you put one herd animal somewhere, they don't actually talk very much because herd animals communicate. And so working out, well, what types of communication they're going to have. Herd animals generally will have warnings to the rest of the herd. So there needs to be this kind of like, perhaps family sort of like, hello, where is everybody else? To, oh dear, there's something really, really bad about to happen. Let's get out of here. And so then we've worked out the vocabulary. So I've probably done a lot of this before I've even started playing with sounds. So then I get to the point of like, all right, well, what do I want to do? And I mentioned that I think bird sounds, pitching through these extremes, can be really quite amazing. And bird sounds, when you pitch shift them down a couple of octaves or even more, you can get incredible textural sounds. And the thing is, I don't have to artificially build a vocabulary. Because if I decide, for instance, we have a bird in Australia called a peewee magpie. It's like a small black and white bird. And they've got a range of sounds, but their range of sounds will be threat sounds, communication sounds. I've got all these sounds. The vocabulary exists. So I can pitch shift it down and I'm still going to get the sense of threat in a warning sound. I'm going to get the sense of community in a hello, where are you sort of thing. I'm going to get the sense of urgency of, oh, I'm hungry, I want to eat from the babies. And so in some ways, it's almost cheating in some ways. It's kind of like I'm stealing another language and I'm just manipulating it to use for my particular thing. Now, I may need to chop and change some of those things, and that's the beauty. When I pitch shift them down and I lengthen them, I might get longer phrases that I can then pull apart, and in a procedural way, I could turn them into a language. Jurassic Park was, I have to say, I was incredibly fortunate for Jurassic Park. It was the second project I'd ever worked on, so I'd only been in the industry for 12 months. And I started working on that. And I was very lucky because I actually do like the franchise. And they sort of said, you've got to write the music for Jurassic Park. And when I was 10, I saw Star Wars and I decided I wanted to be John Williams. And Jurassic Park was basically the opportunity for me to do that. So I started writing some music and I had to not directly rip off John Williams, but write music that was very, very similar to it. And I wrote some music, and back then I had a very simple sample library, 5 CDs of samples that were very, very average. And I had to send these away to our publishers, who was obviously Universal Interactive. And they got back to me and they said, we really quite like the music you're writing. I was like, that was great to hear. It's also, thank you. But they said, we don't like the samples. And I'm like, I don't know what I can do. I mean, I can possibly try and get a better sample library. And they said, no. We want you to go and look at the budgets for real live orchestra. And I'm like, seriously? And so I went off and I got a few quotes. Now, this is over 10 years ago. And at that stage, a lot of people may not remember, the Australian dollar was about 50 cents US. So our dollar was really low. And so I went and got a bunch of quotes, and Universal went, oh, this is fantastic. Yeah, sure, go for it. It's quite inexpensive. So my second ever project, I was told, you can go and write for 70-piece Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, world-class orchestra. Which point, simultaneously, I felt 40 feet tall and terrified. Now, a little bit of backstory of my history is that I went to university initially as an orchestral horn player, and then I did a different university degree in music technology. I had never in my life had a single composition class. I'd never had a single orchestration or scoring class. So when they said, yes, go for an orchestra, I went, fantastic. Oh my God, how am I going to do this? So I had to go out and basically buy a book on orchestration. I got a score of some John Williams music, and I basically had a month to teach myself how to compose, how to orchestrate, how to score, and write the first half of the music. So I did, and I was terrified the whole time. And on the day of the first recording session, we had 2 recording sessions that were split up. That was the best decision I ever made, because it gave me more time. And I rock up on the day, and they sort of said, I wasn't conducting, because that's not my skill set. And they said, all right, well, you'll be the producer for the day. And I'm like, what? I'm not a producer. I said, well, nobody else here knows what's going on. So you're in the booth. It's your call whether we've recorded the thing correctly, whether we move on or whatever. And I'm like, okay. So I had no idea. The entire day went in a blur. I had no idea what was going on the entire day. I said yes to some things, no to some things. I really, really didn't know where I was. And this is in front of, world-class musicians that they've intimidated the heck out of me. At the end of the day, the engineer was really, really lovely. At the end of the day, he basically said, all right, well, you're going to want to have a listen to this. I'll just do a dump, a stereo dump. And in those days, it was onto a DAT tape, and I had a DAT player at home. So he's just literally, and it was like warts and all. It was like, it was just literally a dump of the whole day's recording session. So there was people getting up and down and, mistakes and everything like that. Anyway, he gave me the DAT, and I basically went home, and literally I was shaking, putting this thing into the machine. And I put it on, and I pressed play, and I basically burst into tears. And I burst into tears because it worked. And seriously, for the next 6 months, I was Homer Simpson, solid gold, 40 feet high, completely invulnerable. It was simultaneously the most humbling experience I've ever had and the most amazing experience I've ever had. 70 geniuses turned a whole bunch of scribbles that I put on the page into music that I am still very, very, very proud of. And it is just something that for me, to be speechless, it just was so incredibly significant. Now, just a very slight funny aside is that the week before that recording session, I'd actually had a friend who'd worked for the company, gone somewhere else, approached me and said, look, could I help them out? They'd lost their sound guy. So 2 days after I'd finished recording with a 70-piece orchestra, I was writing the music for a mobile phone game. This was when mobile phones were still black and white, and I had 100 bytes to write the entire score. So I've gone in 1 week from a 70-piece full orchestra to a MIDI file where I actually sat down and went, okay, so the header is 10 bytes. And then it might have been kilobytes, but I think it was kilobytes. I had a few kilobytes and the header was 10 bytes and then every single note was a byte or something like that. And I literally wrote this piece of music that I wanted to, went in and went, it's too big, and then went through and go, okay, I can pull that one drum note out. And I had to literally pull out 5 or 6 notes to get it to fit in. I mean, this was so surreal. But I think that little story of the full orchestra to having 100 bytes to play with typifies everything that is superb about the game industry. I mean, seriously, that stuff is just incredible, that you can have those two things happen to you in the same week. And this is why I adore what I do. With every fiber of my being, I love what I do so much because I get to have something as bizarre as that happen in 1 week. It was interesting. I mean, I think franchise things quite often, especially in those days, didn't have as big a budgets. I mean, the next project that I worked on was Polar Express. And they were building the film while we were building the game. And I mean, it was hilarious because they came up to me at the beginning and said, oh, you won't need to do any music for this. We've got Alan Silvestri doing the music. And I'm like, wow, I can't compete with that. 6 months later, somebody sort of sheepishly comes into my office and said, oh, we've just found out how much Alan Silvestri will cost. And I'm like, oh, really? And they said, can you do the music? Yes. And again, full orchestra. Because they wanted a big orchestral thing. So it was just hilarious. It was this sort of thing that was, I almost felt like I was in some sort of comedy like the IT Crowd or something, because it was just, I was dealing with people who, and I don't mean this maliciously, but they really didn't understand what I was doing. And that was a double-edged sword. I was the entire audio department for 8 years, which means I had carte blanche sometimes to do anything I wanted to, but at the same time, I was working in a void. Like I'd put things out there and say, oh, look, I've done this thing, and everybody going, oh, that's nice. Like, a bit more critique. We don't understand audio. And so I didn't know whether what I was doing was good or bad. And I mean, the Jurassic Park one was the perfect example. I think one of the reasons why I burst into tears is because it was sheer relief. Because if I'd screwed that up, my career would have been gone. So I thank them really sincerely for having the faith in me, because it was a big call on their part. You know, there's like, you know, they listened to the music, so I guess they felt the music was worthy of it, and they just sort of thought, well, we'll take a risk and let this guy go. I think becoming civilized as a species, I think human beings have become complacent. If I took you right now and dumped you in the middle of the Amazon rainforest with just what you have on you right now and said, well, you've got to survive for a week, I would suggest, if you survived, that your hearing would become far more attuned, your sense of smell would become far more attuned, and your sight, in a lot of ways, we don't have threats. Human beings don't have any natural predators other than ourselves. But you'll notice what happens to a human being who goes for a walk at night. You know, they've left the pub, they've got to get home, they've got to walk through a dodgy neighbourhood. They're going to be paying far more attention to their hearing. But on normal everyday, they don't. And there's a very good reason why they don't. It's a defence mechanism. I've recently moved out of a capital city and I'm now living in a country town where after about 5 o'clock at night, it is almost completely silent. When I go back to the capital city for a meeting, it is almost painfully loud. So if you and I go for a walk now down the streets of London and we're trying to have a conversation, we have no choice but to be consciously at all times blocking out about 60 to 80 dB worth of background noise so that we can concentrate on what we're saying. And it's kind of how we work with our eyes. If I look at you, I know there's a bookshelf behind you right at the moment, but I'm focusing on you. So my eyes are focused on you. The bookcase is there, I know it's there, and I can see it sort of from my peripheral vision, but it's blurry, it's like camera focus. We are actually capable of doing things. We're very sophisticated, humans are very sophisticated, and we can do that with sound. We can block out all these extra sounds of other people talking, of the truck going past, of Big Ben going off, of the train going past. But it takes considerable effort for us to do it, which means most people go home and they're exhausted because they've been shielding themselves from all of this. And I've found that when I go back home to the country, I've found that I can just drop all of these defenses and hear things. And this is the thing, I'll give you the perfect example. I can hear our cat walking around the house, right? Light cat padding on carpet. And when the cat comes in and I pat the cat, I can hear my hand moving over the fur. Because one, the environment's very quiet, but two, my hearing is far more attuned now. So I think this is it's a very long answer, but I think basically our entire society has pretty much said, shield yourself from half the noise that's out there, because you've got advertising screaming at you. You've got mobile phones and alarms and fire engines screaming at you. You've got trucks screaming past you. You've got people and crowds and everything like that. So we tend to have to guard ourselves against sound. And so we deprioritize it in our everyday life from a survival point of view. So when we put into a game, even in a game, quite often the things that we're likely to respond to most is bang of a giant gun behind you. You know, I mean, if you put a cat walking through the level softly, most people probably wouldn't even notice it was there, because they've tuned to, you know, only reacting to really loud sounds. This is kind of funny, and I chuckle a little bit to myself when I see people talking about it at conferences and stuff, because there's been some people in the last couple of years who've sort of said, oh, and there's this really good thing, you know, we've got this palette of sound, little raw sounds, and we use those to assemble these bigger sounds, and it saves memory, etc. And the reason why I chuckle to myself is because I did it 10 years ago on a PlayStation 2 for a SpongeBob SquarePants game. And what was even more hilarious is that we used the XAC system for a Sony game, because my programmer basically wrote a little script to get the information from XAC so that we could use it on Sony. But it was hilarious, because it was something that I discovered. I discovered, hang on, I can build a sound in real time. So every time I have an explosion or a rock slide or whatever, or a crash, it's completely unique. Now, this is a technique that is not... It's not a Midas touch. You can't use it for everything all the time. And I wouldn't suggest that you do. I mean, an interface sound, a UI sound, should be consistent. I don't want it to change. I want it to be beep every time I do that, and boop every time I do that, because that's feedback for me, and emotionally I need that to happen that way. But if I'm going to build a forest these days, I would take recordings of birds that usually I'd recorded myself. And I'd record a tree full of birds, and then I would cut it up into individual little tweets and chirps, etc. And then what I would do is I would put those in and it doesn't matter what program I'm using, I would put those into a container that basically would be set up so that every time it needed a bird, it would go through the selection of 8 or 10 sounds that I've got, and it would randomly select one, and it would maybe put a little bit of pitch randomization and volume randomization, and it would more than likely put a bit of positional randomization on it, and then it would trigger that sound. And then it would randomly wait a period of time, and it would trigger another one. Now, quite often those would overlap. So you'd have polyphony that would allow you to have this chirp is still, you know, it's a second and a half, and then, you know, it's still going, and then another one comes in. So what you get is this dovetailing of all these sounds. And so what you're actually doing there is you're generating the ambience of birds in a forest or birds in a tree by selecting those things randomly. And there's a lot of randomness going on, and that's because that's nature. Nature is unpredictable. Nature is full of random events. And so all of what I've just described there would allow me to set up effectively a volumetric sound. So it's kind of like you've got a sphere that is the canopy of a tree. So your traditional, you know, kid would draw a tree with a green round top. So that spherical area has birds confined within that area, but within that confined sphere, they could be anywhere. And we don't know when the next one's going to chirp. And we don't know whether it's going to be pitched up slightly or not. And so all of a sudden, instead of using a loop, which is going to sound pretty ordinary, or if you use a long loop, is going to take up lots of memory, I've created entire forests out of a selection of 8 or 10 bird sounds that select in this way, and has worked out to being less than a meg of memory, that never loops, it never repeats. And moreover, if we talk about what I was talking about before, that particular tree could have that species of birds. Well, I could do the exact same thing over here with the same setup and pitch shift them down, and all of a sudden we've got, for most people will just think that's a different species of bird. You pitch shift them down an octave. And in fact, you could pitch shift them down another octave and have monkeys over there, and you could pitch shift them up 2 octaves and you'll get the little squeaky stuff that sounds like bats. So all of a sudden, not only do I have generative audio that is creating the sound effects or the sound environment that I want in real time, it's incredibly resource efficient. And I can have multiple sounds from these handful of sounds that I've got there. And this applies to rivers and wind and oceans, to explosions and crashes and rock slides, to crowd sounds, to music. And it's something that when it is combined with traditional sound effect design, it can be so much more dynamic. It can be so much more alive, because you're sitting there going, these birds have never looped. In fact, they and in fact, you could do the same thing with like insects and crickets, and then have it attached to a parameter where, as you get close, they go quiet. In the same way, when you step on the ground near crickets, they shut up. You could set up all that sort of stuff. So all of a sudden, we've got dynamic creature sounds as well, all built in the same way. Oh, that's actually a very, very good question. I actually think that a lot of the challenges that we face at the moment are probably less technical, less about getting resources. I mean, we're really lucky. In the 15 years I've been in the industry, I've gone from, as I was saying this the other day, I've gone from I'd make up some sound files, give them to a programmer and go away and pray, to now having really, really deep control of how I create the environment and how I implement things. And that's wonderful. And I think the challenges are, I wouldn't even say that the challenge is trying to get the audience to pay attention, because I think audiences are getting smarter and getting cluier and getting are more choosy about what they want. I actually think there's this middle ground. I think what we need to do is, as an industry, we really need to get the marketing part of our industry on our side, because we've got so many opportunities that are being overlooked. Like you name me a reasonable sized film that comes out that doesn't have a soundtrack release. And yet in 2015, we still have fairly big name games come out. There's no soundtrack because the publishers decide, oh, we're not interested. I'm like, what? This is, as publishers, you're all about generating income. You're more about monetization than any of us are. We're all about the creative side. And yet you have an opportunity here that you're letting slide. The other thing is you've got companies like Dolby who really are, obviously they're into the technology, etc. But Dolby are also very much about making people aware about what's available and what the possibilities are. The current latest technology from them is Dolby Atmos, and they introduce that to people, and people are like, wow, you like sounds up there, that's incredible. And yet we don't really have this part of the game industry who are, apart from the audio people, we really don't have anybody championing our cause. And I think the marketing people, like every new E3 conference or every new game magazine comes out, or every new generation of console that comes out, they're like, oh wow, an extra 5,000 pixels on the screen, and you've got shading for this or that. And I love the graphics. Good graphics is wonderful, but the games that really matter now, to me and to a lot of people, are games with narrative. Now, audio has one purpose. Audio only ever has one purpose, and that's to support narrative. And that's what we do best. We manipulate people's emotions with incredible music. We transport people to amazing locations with incredible audio environments. We convince people about the sincerity of a story more than any visual thing ever could with amazing voice actors. And yet, we've still got people who seem to look at, people within the industry, people in positions of power within the industry, who still seem to have the attitude that, oh yeah, audio is just something. We have to have audio, and we'll do that at the end. And I'm like, what? I'm sorry. The day, there's two things you need to do. Day one, you decide you're going to make a game. Day two is when you talk to somebody about the audio. Because one of the things that I found in the years that I've spent doing this is that, and I didn't realize this until I'd worked on several projects, and then one day, I was talking to somebody, and there was like a couple of artists and a couple of coders, and somebody said, well, how is this supposed to work? Blah, 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 and the artists and the coders were umming and ahhing about it. And I just sort of went, that has to do that. And they're like, well, how do you know? I said, because I know the design better than anybody else does, because I have to, because I'm in charge of doing the music. So I have to underscore every single thing that happens in the game. I have to create the sound effects, and I have to implement them so they match up with every single thing that is animated that could possibly create a sound. I have to be aware of. I have to understand how it works. I have to understand the circumstances where it works. I have to understand the circumstances of when the sounds might change. Same with the dialogue. I have to know every line of dialogue, which means I have to know every character. I have to know the complete story. I have to know the scenarios backwards. You want to know something about the design of a game, talk to the audio lead, because they will know it. And so there's this odd situation where there is so much that is being created that people are being inspired by, and yet they seem to not understand that so much of it is because of the audio. And in fact, I think it was Stafford Baller said yesterday, it's kind of like, if a sound designer does their job properly, it usually means nobody notices the sound. It's only when we screw up that people notice. Now, that doesn't bother me too much from the point of view, I don't necessarily need to be having people cheering me in the street because I'm a sound designer, but it would be good if the people in the industry who we are working for, we are crafting stuff to help somebody's project, understood the benefits that we are providing them. And I think this is the thing. I think in some ways, okay, so if we're not getting the CEOs of the big publishers actually understanding that, then maybe we should be talking directly to the marketing people. Because if the marketing people understand how important what we do is, and how much we can benefit the game, and how much the quality of audio can actually help sell the game, I think if we get the marketing people on board, then everybody else will follow, because I think that's their job. If they're marketing the game and they understand that we're important, they'll be marketing us. Middleware is the thing that allows me to not have to give sound files to a programmer and go away and pray. And as an agnostic, that's an odd situation to be in. Middleware is, let me think of it this way. So it doesn't matter whether you're on Mac or PC. You have an OS, you have your operating system. And your operating system controls your computer. So that's what your game engine is. And your operating system takes input and provides output. The input is your keyboard, your mouse, your game controller, a microphone. The output is your speakers, your screen, maybe the vibrations on your controller, whatever. So in the same way that the game engine is like the OS for a computer, middleware sound engines are basically the plugin that is in charge of all the audio. So what it does two things. It controls the audio to make sure that the audio works the way it should do. And this controls a lot of things. It controls the physics of the audio, the simulated physics of the audio within the game environment. So when something gets further away, it gets quieter, because that's what sound does, is physics. As you walk away from me, the voice of you speaking to me is going to drop off because of the way physics works. So it controls all of that sort of stuff, but it also controls the admin of putting things into the right file format and making sure that they will speak to the channels, the hardware channels of your computer to come out the speakers, etc. So that's the sort of the technical side of things. But from the creative side of things, it's the middleware is the Photoshop. It's the Microsoft Office. It's the Gmail that allows me to craft the words or the images or whatever. It allows me to craft the audio. It gives me a range of tools that allows me to bring in sound files. It allows me to manipulate those sound files, combine them, and in the best examples, it allows me to manipulate those sound files whilst the game is playing, and I can be creating sound directly into the game. And that, we're not quite perfect yet, but we're getting pretty close. Mind you, as soon as you give me something, I'll decide I need something more. I mean, that's the nature of creative people. If you basically give me 50 foot of rope, I'll be like, oh, but what I could do with 55 feet of rope, and it's the same with any creative person. And the beauty of it is that there are several middleware developers, and they're all, and I love the fact that there are several, and I love the fact that they're all competing. because I win. You know, they bring out new features and somebody else brings out new features, and it means that they're driving forwards. And I guess I'm the consumer in that regard. You know, they're trying to make better tools for me to work with, which allows me hopefully to make better audio environments, which means that the player's experience is better. So I think finally this one is good because this sort of speaks to what is fantastic about the game audio industry specifically. And it's kind of funny, I guess, as well. I pretty much was sort of like the boy in a bubble I spent 8 years working for this one studio in Australia, never went overseas, didn't go to GDC or anything like that. So it's actually only been in about the last 4 or 5 years that I'd visited America for the first time, went to things like GDC, and they're fantastic. The very first time was because I was asked to go to present at Game SoundCon. So Brian Schmidt had actually asked Brett to send somebody across to demonstrate FMOD, and Brett had suggested that I go because I think they wanted somebody who wasn't a programmer. They wanted somebody who was a user. And so, you know, it was kind of funny for me. It was a bit sort of like, you know, country kid in the big city sort of thing going to San Francisco, and I loved San Francisco. But it was also my first time to experience how Americans do things. And Australians and Americans are a little bit different. So I turned up to Game SoundCon for the first time, and there was both Brian Schmidt and Paul Lipsome who were involved, and they were sort of doing various different announcements. And I think it possibly was Paul Lipsome who made the first announcement, and then Brian sort of picked up on that, you know, from that point onwards. And they sort of say, oh yes, and you know, we've got lots of things going on this week, and we'll be having Stephan Shu tze from Australia, who'll be doing you know, FMOD demonstrations for the week, and he is the world's authority on FMOD. Now, as an Australian who tends to be a bit self-deprecating, I'm like, you can't say that. No, because from my point of view, if somebody introduces me like that, they're going to have an expectation that I am that, and so because Americans are very more open, out there, confident. And so for me, having, you know, Paul Lipsome and Brian Schmidt introduce me as that, it's kind of made me feel very, very awkward. But everybody was great about it. So it's sort of become this little bit of this running gag, and like people sort of say, oh, you're the FMOD guy. And it's like, well, you know, I don't work for FMOD. I have a relationship with FMOD, and I do know how to use FMOD, but I'm never going to claim that I'm the world's authority, because I'm sure there are people out there that know things that I don't, and vice versa. So that was the funny introduction to the game industry at large. But what was really special for me was there were some people at this event who, in a lot of ways, were my idols. I really, really loved the work that they did. And I got to meet people who I'd been communicating with for many years via email. But I got to meet these people for the first time. And the first one was one who, this gentleman walks up to me, and he's wearing a long coat, which means that his conference tag is under the coat, and I can't see his name. And he's like, oh, Stephan, and he's talking to me and everything like that. And I have no idea. I'm smiling, yes, I have no idea who this person is, until he takes a step forward and his coat moves, and I see the name tag that says Alexander Brandon. At which point I literally leap onto him and give him a hug, because he's a wonderful guy, and he's worked on projects that I have so much respect for. But there was no ego there. It's almost like I'm in the presence of one of my superheroes. And it went on like that. The last day of Game SoundCon, Brian very, very generously takes all these people out to dinner. And I'm sitting at this table with Mike Moraski, who's done all the music for Portal. And, you know, several people who have either been or are or were going to be audio directors at Microsoft. And Alex Brandon and Lenny Moore, who'd done the music for Outcast. And I'm surrounded by all these people, and had this instant moment of doubt of, why on earth am I sitting here? I felt like a child sitting amongst not just adults, but, you know, really significant adults. And the thing was that there wasn't a single ego at the table. Every single person at that table it was literally almost a collection of the nicest people I'd ever met. And I think this is one of the important things about the game industry. And that influenced me so much that anytime I get a student or a young person or approach me or send me an email, I answer every single email. I make time for every single people I meet, because I try to pass on that same sincere, welcoming kindness and openness that all of these people greeted me with. And I think that more than anything else is the strength of the audio part of the game industry. Practically no egos, very open, very supportive, very friendly, just wonderful, wonderful people. And that's why I'm just, I love working in this industry with these people, because they are just amazing. And every time I come to an event like this, I get to meet more amazing people.
I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Oh, seriously, I mean, off camera, but like these, it was incredible. Like, I sometimes had to almost stop myself from just going all fanboy. I'm like, oh my God, you did the music for Portal. And I'm just kind of like, wow, I really like your stuff for Portal. You know, and it is this whole thing. Inside, I'm feeling like a little over-energetic girl who's just been given a giant bunny rabbit and just wanting to run around sort of like giggling insanely. And on the surface, I'm trying to remain professional and calm and just go, oh, wow, you know, love your work. And in fact, Gary Scheinman is the most amazing. I got introduced to him like in a 5-second thing. We were walking into a restaurant and he was with Clint Bajakian and Michael Roach, and I was having lunch with Scott, and I knew everybody there except Gary, and they all introduced me and then said, oh, and this is Gary Scheinman. And I just went, wow, lovely to meet you. And Pair Bonded is one of the most sublime pieces of music I've ever heard. And like I knew the name of the piece. And this is the opening piece from Bioshock 2. And he just said, wow, thank you very, very much. And what was that was kind of a cute bit. But what was really interesting is when I saw him again at Game SoundCon last year, there's a bunch of people standing around and that sort of broke up. And he just sort of turned to me and I said, you probably don't remember, but we've actually met. He said, no, I do remember. We met at lunch and you made a really lovely comment about that piece of music. He's incredible. He's such a lovely guy. And the thing is that, I mean, we all like being told that something that we've done is significant. And I mean, I've had people send me emails about the Jurassic Park music, and it's beautiful. It is really beautiful to have somebody say, you know, I still listen to your music from this thing after 10 years. It's like, wow, really? Seriously, that's just, you know, that's the gold plating on the trophy or whatever.